Hey everyone, welcome back to IDEANTHRO Movement and IDEANTHRO Water. We're going to do a little joint episode here today. This is primarily a movement-based episode, but we are going to draw an analogy in this episode that uses our experience in the urban water industry and creek revegetation to make a point about our movement practice. So we thought we'd make this a water episode because there is relevance here for the water industry. So, as a reminder, this is week 3 of IDEANTHRO Movement, and we're talking primarily about why we use real movements in our movement practice, as opposed to other isolation exercises or stylized movements like barbell back squats, barbell deadlifts, bench press, etc. This episode is going to go a little bit tangential to that though, so just bear with us. So, the analogy that we're going to make here is between our approach to a movement practice, and we're going to draw a distinction between how one goes about doing gold standard high level bushland revegetation or creek revegetation, which we have a little bit more familiarity with because it's urban water management that we are interested in over at IDEANTHRO Water. We're going to draw the distinction between how people do that and gardening. Okay, so let's get into it. So the gold standard, if you've got a degraded bushland area or a degraded creek that you need to revegetate the banks of that creek, let's say, the gold standard as to how you do that is you come along and you prepare the area. Perhaps you need to remove a whole bunch of weeds out of there. You maybe need to mulch the area to make the conditions on the surface decent. You're going to come in and you're going to plant a huge variety of different species of plants. And not only different species, but also with different habits, different types. So understory species, canopy species, mid-story species, and also that fill different ecological roles. So pioneers, so a pioneer plant is one that when you've had degraded land, it will grow in that land and grow quickly and get up and get some canopy cover, get some shade, start dropping leaf litter on the surface, build organic matter in the soil. So it's a plant that grows really, really quickly out of degraded conditions. Can typically do very well in those conditions, but typically is short-lived and will die off and then let other species come through. So in this picking a variety of plants, you're going to put some pioneers in there. You're also going to pick some longer-lived species, and the pioneers are going to grow up quickly. And then the longer-lived ones are going to grow slowly. The pioneers will die off, but the longer-lived ones will come through. And see where this is going. But the fundamental tenet of all of this is that we're not ultimately here saying, the riparian area that we're rehabbing is going to look exactly like this. Look, it's going to have that plant there, it's going to have that plant there, it's going to have that plant there, and we're going to tend to those. Instead, we're creating the general conditions to create a generally healthy system. So the system overall is healthy because that's actually what we care about. We don't actually care whether there is that particular tree right there. What we care about is whether the system as a whole is healthy and functions for its habitat and blah, 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 blah. So we specify the conditions that will create that healthy system as a whole, but we don't specify exactly how it's going to come about or exactly how it's going to develop. We give it a helping hand. Contrast that to gardening. Gardening, on the other hand, you plant the plants exactly where you want them. Look, if you're doing vegetable gardening with a permaculture approach, it's more like rehabbing a forest. But if you're building like a cottage garden, let's say, then your approach is far more like, look, I want that plant there, so I'm going to plant it there. And I want that plant there, I'm going to plant it there. I'm going to hedge it in that shape. I'm going to pull out the weeds of it. I'm going to manually tend to it, make it perfect. Now, sometimes you try things, right? Sometimes you're like, I don't know if that's going to grow, but I'm going to try it there because I do want it there if it will grow there. So everything's very deliberate, and we're very deliberately building the specifics of the garden that we want. Well, in this analogy, gardening is bodybuilding and the functional fitness industry where we're like, I want big biceps, a flat stomach, and I want to be able to pick up 100 kilos in a deadlift, let's say. Our approach to movement is far more like the forest in the sense that we're going, look, we're not specifically after any attributes. You will get a healthy body. You will build a whole bunch of attributes. You will probably put on more muscle mass. You will probably find that your stomach flattens out. But we're not actually going about chasing any of those attributes deliberately. We are simply creating the conditions for a healthy body to emerge, comes back to the previous episode, to emerge out of what we are asking of it. there's a few reasons that this is important. One that I'd like to highlight here, though, is particularly relevant to the analogy that we're drawing here. So one of the key differences between growing the forest and building the garden is the fact that the forest or the riparian rehab, the long term is to make it self-sustainable. If you are in these sorts of industries, you probably, and you're going out and doing these things, you probably have a goal, you're probably interested in environmental management, environmental conservation, and recognize that we need to restore large amounts of these sorts of areas to have a meaningful impact on the health of our environment in our urban areas. We need to do a fair whack of this restoration. And if every time we do that restoration, we have to tend to it long term, to keep it healthy so it doesn't become overrun with weeds or otherwise have problems, doesn't need to be watered, whatever, it's pretty obvious that we need to create these rehabbed bushland or riparian areas that are self-sustainable. Because if we did need to weed them more constantly and tend them more constantly, it will simply be too costly to do it on the wide scale that we need to make a meaningful difference to the health of our environment. So we need to make them sustainable. And so that's a large part of how you do that approach, is you're actually trying to build a system that's self-sustaining and creates the interactions to, by and large, look after itself. Not entirely, you might need to do bits, but you're trying to minimize the input. Gardening, on the other hand, has very little thought towards that. Gardening has this mentality of, we want it to be exactly like this. And as a result, you end up, weed comes up, I got to pull the weed out. Oh, look, that's great, I got to hedge it again. Oh, look, that plant got a little bit sick, so I'm going to pull it out and replace it with another one of the same species, right? It's a very manually intensive approach to doing things. And that's the approach that you end up stuck in with things like bodybuilding or chasing specific goals or the functional fitness industry, is because we're trying to tend to individual components, things get out of balance and problems pop up all the time because we haven't created a system as a whole that can self-regulate. Individual things pop up, you get injured, I overworked that biceps and now I've got tightness in the front of my chest, I'm getting issues with my spine, I'm getting rounded, whatever, I can't raise my shoulders overhead, so now I have to do mobility to fix the shoulder overhead issue, and so on and so on and so on and so on. This stuff gets totally out of hand. The real movement point of view looks at this and goes, no. What we're going to do is we're going to create conditions akin to those with which how our bodies evolved in, how our ancestors evolved, the sorts of conditions are doing real movements in large variety, and in enough variety these start to self-regulate and start to make a healthy body as a whole, rather than building, I overdeveloped this component. You see this all the time. If you go and talk to physios or chiros about bodybuilders, they'll say things like, they've overdeveloped the main prominent superficial, so on the outside, muscle groups, and they've neglected all the stabilizers and all this other stuff. By going for real movements in the real world in high variety and high diversity, and not just targeting these superficial muscles, we actually build a far more resilient body. We've also, because we've touched a whole much wider base of things, like the forest that we planted really diversely, we've also got more ability to respond if the real world asks us to do something weird. If the real world suddenly asks us to stabilize in a funny position that's not the ideal way for our knee or our hip to stabilize. Because we've got some experience moving out of idealized patterns out of the garden, we've got some ability to deal with that. In the same way, the forest, because we have so many different species, if an unexpected event happens, then you're more likely to have species that can, of its own, come in and colonize and deal with it before the weeds get in, let's say. But in a garden, where you don't necessarily have that diversity or anything's heavily manicured, it's less likely that that's going to happen. So it's a real shift in mindset here. Our approach at IDEANTHRO Movement is not at all about tending to individual components, but rather setting up the conditions, like we do with the riparian rehab, setting up the conditions from which a functional whole system can emerge. Okie dokie. And that's the end of the episode. I hope you found that interesting. Whether you are an IDEANTHRO Movement viewer or you are coming across to this episode from our IDEANTHRO Water audience. If you liked it, by all means, give us a like or a subscribe. If you'd like to know more about, if you've been watching these videos for movement and you suddenly just were like, huh, that was interesting. They were talking about environmental issues and bushland management. If you want to find out more about that stuff, you can go to ideanthro.com/water. But if you're here for the movement, you can find out more about what it is we do at ideanthro.com/movement. You can find out about our movement facility in Oxley, Brisbane, Australia. You can also, if you want to, you can come down for a free trial and give it a go at ideanthro.com/free-trial. Hit us up there, we'll arrange a time. And if you just want to get in touch, maybe ask a question, expand on this analogy, whatever you want to do, you can find us at ideanthro.com/connect. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.